The officer in charge filed the report, stamped it classified, and sent it to Washington. He didn't tell the men what he really saw, the faint glow still shimmering in the cracks, the way the air vibrated around the circle, the way the hum followed him all the way back to the fort, thrumming in his bones like a heartbeat. He didn't mention the dream either. The dream where a boy with silver eyes stood at the foot of his bed and whispered in a voice that wasn't a voice at all, "We're not done yet." By then, Braintree was already a ghost town. The exodus began quietly. First, the church folk who believed the devil had come to claim the valley. Then the farmers who swore their cows were birthing dead calves with silver eyes. Then the school teacher who locked herself in her house and wouldn't stop screaming until they dragged her out and sent her away in a wagon. Within a month, the town was empty but for a handful of stubborn men who refused to leave their land. They didn't last long. Their bodies were found in the woods, broken and bloodless, their faces locked in masks of terror. The sheriff who found them went mad 2 days later, tearing out his own eyes with his fingernails. The Caldwell name became a curse. People spat when they heard it, as if the word itself was poison. No one spoke of Margaret. No one spoke of the boy. But they all heard the hum, faint at first, like a distant swarm of bees, then louder and louder, until the ground itself seemed to throb with it, until water rippled in buckets and windows rattled in their frames, until birds fell from the sky, their tiny bodies twitching and smoking as silver light leaked from their eyes. It wasn't just Braintree anymore. The sound traveled, across the hills, across the rivers, across the country. The world was listening. In Washington, men in dark suits sat around polished tables, their faces pale, their voices tight. Words like extraterrestrial, mutation, and containment protocol hissed through the air like serpents. Files were opened, orders were signed, entire towns were cordoned off. People disappeared. They sent in the first team, a dozen men in black uniforms with rifles slung across their backs and strange machines humming on their belts. They marched into the Vermont woods under a sky heavy with snow and silence. Only 2 came back. The survivors spoke of a light that wasn't light, a sound that wasn't sound. They spoke of trees bending like wax, of bullets melting in midair, of men being unmade, pulled apart not by force but by something deeper, something that tore them out of existence thread by thread. They said the boy was at the center, floating above the earth, his eyes like twin stars, his body wrapped in light so bright it burned their shadows into the ground. They said he smiled at them. The survivors were locked away, their mouths sewn shut by fear or by something else. No one ever saw them again. Margaret Caldwell appeared one last time in the spring of 1869 on a lonely road near Concord. A farmer driving his cart at dusk saw a woman standing in the middle of the path, her dress in tatters, her hair hanging in filthy ropes. She was barefoot. Her skin was gray, her cheeks hollow, her eyes sunken and dead. The farmer slowed, called out, but she didn't answer. She just stood there, her arms hanging limp at her sides, her head cocked like a broken doll. And then she smiled. Not at him, past him. The farmer turned and saw the boy. Timothy. He was taller now, too tall for his age, his limbs long and thin, his skin glowing faintly in the fading light. His eyes were silver pools that reflected nothing. And the hum. The hum was everywhere now, shaking the wheels of the cart, rattling the farmer's teeth, making the horses rear and scream. The boy raised a hand. Just one small hand. The world folded. That's what the farmer said later. When they found him wandering 10 miles away, blind and raving, his hair turned pure white. He said the trees bent backward, the sky split open, and something came through. Not a thing, not a creature, a presence, vast and terrible and beautiful. He said he saw 1,000 suns burning in an endless dark, and all of them were looking at him. Then he laughed, and laughed, and laughed, until his voice broke and blood bubbled on his lips. They put him in an asylum. He lived another 20 years. He never stopped laughing. By the summer of 1870, strange lights filled the sky over the northeast. People whispered of children disappearing from their beds, of voices calling from the rivers, of silver eyes watching from the dark. Scientists came with their instruments, their notebooks, their equations. They left with empty eyes and shattered minds. The government built walls of silence. Towns were erased from maps, families were relocated, files were burned, but rumors spread like fire, carried on the lips of drifters and soldiers and madmen. The last thing anyone saw, if the stories can be believed, was Timothy. He floated above the church steeple, his body glowing so bright it hurt to look at him, his limbs stretched and twisted, his head tilted back as though drinking in the night. His mouth hung open, and the hum poured from him like a storm, ripping the town apart piece by piece, and then silence. When the riders returned 3 days later, there was nothing left. No houses, no roads, no bodies, just a crater. A vast, blackened crater burned into the earth, its edges jagged like broken teeth. And at the center of that crater, fused into the glassy soil, was a shape. Small, child-sized, curled like a sleeping boy. But it wasn't Timothy. It was something else, something no one could name. The government sealed the site within a week. Soldiers with rifles and bayonets kept everyone out while men in black coats and strange machines combed the ruins. They took samples, took photographs, whispered in low voices. Then one day they were gone too. The fences stayed, and signs went up. Danger. Keep out. But no one needed signs. No one ever went near that place again, and for a while, it seemed over. Until the reports began. The first came from a logging camp in Vermont, nearly 100 miles from Braintree. Workers claimed they saw lights in the trees late at night, pale and pulsing, and heard a low hum that made their teeth ache. One man vanished without a trace, then another. When the company shut the camp down, they found something burned into the earth where the bunkhouse once stood. A perfect circle of glassy soil, still warm to the touch. Then came the factory fire in Lowell. The newspapers said it was an accident, a boiler explosion. But the survivors told a different story. About the humming that started in the walls, about the way the machines twisted and bent before they burst into flames, about the boy they saw in the smoke. A boy with silver eyes. By the time the army moved in, the factory was nothing but ashes. The sightings spread after that, across New England, across the country. Always the same signs. Lights, humming, disappearances. Always the same aftermath. Circles burned into the ground, silver left behind, and sometimes, just sometimes, someone who swore they saw a boy watching from the dark, a boy who smiled. The scientists called it impossible, the priests called it unholy, the newspapers called it a hoax, but the ones who saw it, the ones who heard the hum, they never doubted. They knew the truth. Timothy Caldwell wasn't gone. He was changing. And whatever he was becoming, it wasn't human. They tried to contain it. That's what the government papers said years later, when the files were declassified. They built facilities underground, deep and cold, lined with steel and lead. They brought in the boy, or what was left of him, wrapped in chains that melted like wax when he screamed. They studied him, tested him, cut him open and found no blood, no bone, nothing but light. And still, he grew. No walls could hold him, no chains could bind him. Every time they tried, the humming returned, louder than before, tearing metal like paper, boiling men alive in their armor. And when he rose from the ruins of their machines, his eyes burning like suns, they understood the truth. Timothy Caldwell wasn't a boy anymore. He was something else, something vast, something infinite. Something that science could never explain. The last entry in the file was dated April 3rd, 1902. It contained only 3 words, scrawled in a shaking hand. The light speaks. And then, nothing. Some say he's still out there, moving through the dark, calling to those who will listen. Some say he isn't a who anymore, but a what? A force, a hunger, a storm that wears the shape of a child when it needs to. And some say the circles still appear, burned into the earth in places no man should ever go, glowing faintly when the moon is high. If you ever find one, they say, don't look too long, don't listen too close, because if you do, you'll hear it. The hum, low, endless, waiting, and when you turn, you'll see him, standing in the shadows, smiling. The first official report came from a U.S. Army outpost near Fort Shaw, nearly 30 miles from Braintree. A routine patrol stumbled upon something in the snow, a perfect circle burned deep into the frozen ground. It measured 30 feet across, the edges fused like molten glass, the center black and cracked as if scorched by lightning. But there had been no storms, no fire, no sign of life, except for the footprints, small ones, bare feet, a child's. They circled the blackened earth, spiraling inward until they vanished at the center. The prints weren't filled with snow like the others. They steamed. The soldiers swore they saw heat rising from them, curling in the frigid air like smoke from an unseen fire. Just a circle burned into the earth, so deep the soil turned to glass. And then the disappearances began. The fire should have ended everything. That's what the town believed, or at least what they told themselves as they stood among the smoking ruins of the Caldwell house. The smell of charred wood clung to the air, bitter and thick, while the ground hissed and steamed where embers still smoldered. The circle of scorched earth was unnatural, perfectly round, burned so deep the soil had turned black and shiny like obsidian. No one spoke of it, but they all saw it, and they all felt it. Nothing about that fire was right. There were no bones, no scraps of clothing, nothing human at all. It was as though the flames had swallowed everything and left behind only that black ring, glowing faintly in the first pale light of dawn. The sheriff ordered everyone back to town, but no one slept that night. Not really. Mothers kept their children close, their eyes darting to the windows every time the wind groaned through the trees. Men sat on porches with shotguns across their knees, staring into the dark as though daring it to move. But nothing came. For 2 days, the woods were silent. The hum was gone. The glow was gone. People began to breathe easier. Maybe it was over. Maybe the fire had done its work. Maybe Margaret and the boy were dead. Then the disappearances began. The first was Thomas Hale, a farmhand who lived alone near the river. His neighbor found his cabin door wide open one morning. The fire in the hearth burned down to ash, the bed neatly made. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, no footprints. Just one thing out of place, a silver coin on the floor, gleaming in the dust. Then came Martha Leland, the spinster who kept to herself on the North Road. Her cat was found dead on the porch, its body twisted, its eyes shining like glass. Martha was never seen again. By the end of the week, 6 people were gone, vanished without a trace, and every time the same thing was left behind: silver. A coin, a button, a nail, but silver every time, gleaming in the dim light like a calling card. Panic gripped the town like a vice. People stopped leaving their homes after dark. They nailed their windows shut, barred their doors, whispered prayers in trembling voices. But it didn't matter, because the thing they feared didn't need doors. It didn't need windows. It didn't even need a body. Not anymore. The first sighting came from a boy named Samuel Briggs, the same boy whose father had once seen Timothy vanish in the cornfield. Samuel was 12 now, old enough to know fear and young enough to speak the truth without shame. He swore he saw a light in the woods late one night, a silver glow pulsing like a heartbeat. And then he saw Timothy. Not the Timothy they remembered, not the frail, sickly child. This Timothy was taller, his limbs too long, his skin pale as moonlight. His eyes were silver still, but brighter now, glowing like molten metal. Samuel said he spoke without opening his mouth. The words slid into Samuel's head like oil. "Come with me." Samuel ran. He didn't stop until his lungs burned and his legs gave out. When his father found him, he was babbling, his eyes wide with terror, and on his cheek was a mark, a perfect circle, burned into the skin, so hot it still smoked. After that, no one doubted. Whatever Timothy had become, it was still here, and it was growing stronger. The town called for help. Men rode to the nearest cities, seeking soldiers, scientists, priests, anyone who could fight what they couldn't understand. But by the time they returned, it was too late, because Braintree was gone. No one knows exactly what happened the night the town fell. There were no survivors to tell the tale, only whispers, only fragments of stories pieced together from what was left behind. They say it began with the bells. At midnight, the church bell began to toll, slow and heavy, though no hand touched the rope. Then the others joined. The iron bell at the schoolhouse, the cracked one in the town hall, all of them ringing at once, clanging wildly in the dark. People woke to the sound, their hearts pounding, their ears aching as the noise grew louder and louder until it shook the very walls. Then came the light. It rose from the woods first, a cold silver glow that pulsed and writhed like something alive. It spread across the fields, over the river, through the streets, flooding every shadow, devouring the dark. Doors blew open. Windows shattered inward. The air shimmered like glass as the temperature dropped so fast, frost bloomed on the walls. And then the hum began. They heard it in their bones before they heard it in their ears, a deep, thrumming vibration that crawled under their skin, coiled around their hearts, and squeezed. Babies screamed, dogs howled, horses reared and tore free from their ropes, eyes rolling white with terror. And the church itself, torn apart from the inside, windows blown out, the altar splintered like kindling. No storm did that. "We'll find them," Alden said finally, his voice tight. "The boy and the woman. We'll find them, and we'll get to the bottom of this." But deep down, he didn't believe his own words. Margaret Caldwell was seen that morning on the old logging road, barefoot and wild-eyed, clutching her boy to her chest. Or at least that's what Amos Pritchard swore when he staggered into town at midday, pale as a ghost. He'd been hauling timber when he saw her, standing at the edge of the trees, her hair plastered to her face, her dress ripped to tatters. Beside her, holding her hand, was Timothy. Amos said he didn't look right, too tall for his age, too thin, and his eyes. "Like mirrors," Amos whispered, shivering despite the heat. "Like looking straight into hell." When Amos called out, Margaret turned her head slowly, her face slack and empty, and Timothy smiled. That smile haunted Amos for the rest of his life. It wasn't the smile of a child. It was cold, knowing, hungry. Then they walked into the woods, and Amos didn't follow. By evening, every able-bodied man in Braintree was armed and ready. Shotguns, rifles, axes, even pitchforks. They gathered by the sheriff's office, their breath fogging in the chill, their voices low. Some spoke of demons, others of curses. A few muttered about scientists, about strange experiments left over from the war. But none of them said what they were all thinking. What if Timothy wasn't human anymore? They split into 3 groups and headed into the woods. The trees closed around them like prison bars, their bare branches clawing at the sky. The ground was slick with mud, sucking at their boots as they pushed deeper into the dark. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves, the creak of leather, and the distant cry of crows. It felt wrong in those woods, like the world itself was holding its breath. They found the first sign an hour in. A dead deer, lying in a clearing, its body twisted like the caretaker's, its eyes silver and gleaming even in death. The men crossed themselves, whispering prayers. Something was hunting in these woods, something that didn't kill to eat but to destroy. And then they heard it. The hum. Faint at first, threading through the trees like a whisper, then growing louder, vibrating in their bones. The men froze, gripping their weapons tighter, eyes darting in every direction. The sound wasn't coming from one place. It was everywhere, above them, beneath them, inside them. The air shimmered faintly, bending like heat rising from a forge. Then they saw the light. It flickered deep in the woods, cold and silver, pulsing like a heartbeat. The men moved toward it, their steps slow, their breaths ragged. The closer they came, the louder the hum grew, until it wasn't a sound but a force, pressing against their skulls, making their teeth ache and their vision blur. One man dropped to his knees, clutching his head, blood trickling from his nose. Another turned and ran, screaming. Sheriff Alden pushed forward, his jaw clenched, his rifle gripped so tight his knuckles bled. He stepped into the clearing and stopped dead. Margaret was there. She stood in the center of the clearing, her dress in shreds, her hair floating around her face as though caught in some invisible current. Her eyes were silver now, glowing faintly in the dark, and her lips moved in a soundless prayer. In her arms was Timothy. Only it wasn't Timothy anymore. The boy floated inches above the ground, his limbs hanging loose, his head tilted back. Light poured from his skin, pulsing in waves that bent the air. His eyes were open, wide and silver, and from his mouth came the hum, deep, relentless, shaking the earth. "Dear God," someone whispered behind Alden. "What is it?" The boy's head turned slowly, unnaturally, until those silver eyes locked on Alden. And then he smiled. The light flared, blinding. The hum became a scream. Trees tore from the earth like blades of grass, hurling through the air. Men flew like rag dolls, their bones snapping like twigs. Alden fired, the shot cracking through the chaos, but the bullet never reached the boy. It hung in the air, suspended, spinning slowly before melting into nothing. Alden ran. God help him, he ran, the screams of his men tearing through the woods behind him. He didn't stop until he burst into the open fields, gasping for breath, blood streaming from his ears. When they found him at dawn, he was raving, his eyes wide and wild, muttering the same word over and over, "Light." That night, the Caldwell house burned to the ground. No one knew who set the fire. Some said it was the sheriff trying to end the nightmare. Others whispered that Margaret did it herself, trying to destroy what she had brought into the world. But when the flames died and the ashes cooled, there were no bodies, no bones, nothing. "Margaret," Hollis said again, his voice firm now, though fear crawled through his veins like ice water. "What have you done?" Her laughter was soft at first, almost like a sob, then grew louder, sharper, until it echoed against the stone walls like the cry of something not human. She turned toward the Reverend, tears cutting paths through the dirt on her face. "What I had to," she whispered. Before Hollis could speak, the lantern flickered violently, casting shadows that twisted and writhed like living things. The air grew heavy, pressing down on them like an invisible hand. And then came the sound, the hum. Low at first, like a distant storm, then rising, growing, vibrating through the floor, the pews, the very air in their lungs. The caretaker screamed, clutching his ears, his rosary beads scattering like seeds across the floor. Hollis staggered back, his heart pounding so hard it hurt, his eyes fixed on the altar. The boy's chest was moving, slowly, deliberately. Timothy's eyes opened and the Reverend felt his soul shatter. They were silver again, pure, gleaming silver, catching the lantern light and throwing it back like molten steel. No pupil, no whites, just endless, merciless shine. His lips parted and the hum poured from his mouth, shaking the walls, splintering the wooden cross above the altar. Dust rained from the rafters. The caretaker fell to his knees, screaming prayers until his voice was drowned by the sound. Margaret reached for her son, tears streaming down her face, her hands trembling as though the power inside him burned her skin. "Timothy," she whispered, her voice breaking. "My baby." The boy sat up slowly, the blanket falling away, revealing a body too thin, ribs jutting like bars of a cage. But his skin, it glowed faintly, like frost under moonlight. His movements were jerky, unnatural, as though he were learning how to move all over again. He turned his head toward his mother and blinked, slow, mechanical. "Mama," he said. The word was wrong. The voice was wrong. It was Timothy's mouth that spoke, but the sound was hollow, distorted, like wind whistling through a broken pipe. Margaret sobbed, reaching for him, but Hollis grabbed her arm, pulling her back. "Don't!" he shouted, his voice cracking with terror. "That's not your boy!" Timothy's head snapped toward the Reverend so fast it was like a whip crack. For a moment, Hollis swore the boy smiled, a cold, empty smile that didn't reach his eyes. Then the lantern shattered, plunging the church into darkness. What happened next was chaos. The hum turned into a roar, deafening, relentless. The walls shook, and the great stained glass window behind the altar exploded inward, raining shards of colored glass like deadly rain. Hollis dragged Margaret toward the door, feeling splinters and glass tear at his skin. The caretaker crawled, sobbing, his hands slick with blood. And through it all, that sound, rising, rising, until it was no longer a sound but a force, crushing the breath from their lungs, pressing on their bones. Hollis thought he saw light in the darkness, silver light pouring from Timothy like water, filling the church, devouring the shadows until there was nothing left but blinding white. Then silence. When Hollis woke, he was lying in the mud outside the church, rain pelting his face. The sky was black, split by forks of lightning. The caretaker was dead, his body twisted, his eyes wide and staring at nothing. Margaret was gone, and so was the boy. The storm raged long into the night, tearing branches from trees and flooding the dirt roads, but nothing could wash away the fear that had taken hold of Braintree. By dawn, word of what happened at the church had spread like wildfire. People whispered in hushed voices, their faces pale, their hands trembling as they crossed themselves and locked their doors. Reverend Hollis, battered and bruised, sat in the sheriff's office, his hands wrapped in bloodied bandages. His eyes were hollow, staring into a cup of untouched coffee gone cold. Sheriff Alden paced the floor, his boots thudding against the wood, anger masking the fear that gnawed at his gut. "You expect me to believe this?" the sheriff demanded, slamming his fist on the desk. "That a boy, an 8-year-old boy, did all that?" Hollis looked up slowly, his voice hoarse. "You weren't there, Alden. You didn't hear it. You didn't see those eyes." "Silver eyes," the sheriff muttered, shaking his head. "And what? He just vanished? Poof! Gone like smoke?" Hollis swallowed hard, his hands trembling. "Not smoke," he whispered. "Light. Blinding light." Alden cursed under his breath, dragging a hand through his thinning hair. He wanted to dismiss it, wanted to believe the old man had gone mad from the storm, from the chaos. But then there was the caretaker's body, twisted like a rag doll, his bones shattered, his eyes frozen wide in terror. It was as though the boy had vanished into thin air. That night, the town was alive with fear. Fathers bolted their doors. Mothers kept candles burning by the bedsides of their children. No one knew what had happened. Some said it was the devil. Others whispered about witchcraft, about curses from the old world that had followed settlers across the sea. A few even claimed it wasn't Timothy at all, that the boy who came back from the clinic wasn't the same boy who had left home weeks before. Theories spread like wildfire. Miss Price, bruised and trembling, told her story in a shaking voice, how the noise came from him, how the air bent and the light shimmered. Some laughed nervously, calling it hysteria. But others remembered the graveyard sightings, the whispers in the night, the pale glow in the woods. And then someone mentioned the war, that terrible, bloody war that had taken so many sons and left the earth soaked with death. What if something had come back with it? Something old, something hungry? 3 days later, Timothy returned. It was dawn when a milkman saw him standing at the edge of the river, barefoot, his clothes soaked through as though he had walked out of the water. His hair was plastered to his forehead, and his eyes, they were wrong again. No color, just silver, bright and unblinking, catching the morning light like polished steel. When the milkman called out, Timothy didn't move. He didn't speak. He just turned slowly, looked at the man, and smiled. But it wasn't a child's smile. It was too cold, too knowing. By the time others arrived, Timothy was gone again, leaving only wet footprints in the grass. They led a few yards into the woods and then stopped. Just stopped, like the earth had swallowed him whole. People started locking their doors in the middle of the day. Mothers kept their children close, whispering prayers as they crossed themselves at night. Some wanted to call the sheriff from the next town, but others said it was useless. What could the law do against something like this? And then came the night Margaret Caldwell appeared in the church, carrying a bundle in her arms. The church was nearly empty that night. Only Reverend Hollis and the old caretaker were there, finishing their prayers when the door creaked open with a sound that made both men turn. The wind outside howled through the cracks of the wooden frame, carrying with it the scent of rain and something else. Something metallic, sharp, like the tang of blood. Margaret Caldwell stood in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the pale glow of the lantern she carried. Her dress clung to her body, soaked through as though she had walked through a storm. Though no rain had fallen, her hair was loose, hanging in damp ropes around her face, and her eyes looked empty, hollowed out by something far darker than grief. In her arms was a bundle wrapped in a gray wool blanket. At first, Reverend Hollis thought it was firewood. Then he saw the shape beneath the fabric, the unmistakable shape of a child. "Margaret," he whispered, stepping forward, his voice trembling despite his years of preaching against fear. "What's happened?" She didn't answer. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Her hands tightened around the bundle as though afraid it might fall, or worse, escape. Slowly she moved down the aisle, her boots leaving dark, wet marks on the wooden floor. The caretaker crossed himself, muttering a prayer under his breath, his eyes wide with something close to terror. When she reached the altar, Margaret laid the bundle down with a care that broke the Reverend's heart. The blanket shifted slightly, and a small, pale hand slipped out, thin as porcelain, fingers curled like claws. Hollis knelt, his old knees aching as he reached to pull back the fabric. He hesitated for only a moment before uncovering the boy's face. It was Timothy, or what was left of him. His skin was white as bone, his lips tinged with blue, and his eyes closed, thank God. But there was something wrong about the stillness of him, something that made Hollis's stomach twist in a way no corpse ever had. He had buried soldiers, infants, men taken by fever, but none of them had ever looked like this. Like they weren't gone. Not really. Like they were waiting. "Is he?" The caretaker couldn't finish the question. Margaret finally spoke, her voice cracked and broken, like the sound of dry leaves crushed underfoot. "He's not dead," she whispered. Hollis froze, staring at her as though she had gone mad. "Margaret," he said softly, "look at him. The Lord has called your boy home." Her head snapped up, and for the first time he saw fire in her eyes, wild, desperate fire. "No," she hissed, "he isn't gone. He speaks to me, in my dreams, in the dark. He calls my name." The caretaker backed away slowly, muttering more prayers, his hands shaking so hard the rosary beads slipped through his fingers and clattered to the floor. That should have been the end of it. A grieving mother, a sickly child. People wanted to forget, but they couldn't, because after that day, strange things began to happen whenever Timothy was near. Clocks stopped working, metal objects bent as if softened by heat, though there was no fire. Animals acted strange. Dogs growled low when he walked past, and horses refused to go near him. Children said they heard whispers when Timothy was close, whispers that weren't coming from his mouth. And sometimes, in the dead of night, people saw a pale light glowing in the woods where the Caldwell house stood, a light too bright to be a lantern and too steady to be a fire. And then there was the incident at the schoolhouse, the one that no one would ever forget. The schoolhouse sat on a small hill at the edge of town, a single-room building painted white, its windows tall and narrow like watchful eyes. On that cold autumn morning, the children gathered as they always did, their laughter echoing across the yard as fallen leaves crunched under their boots. The air smelled of wood smoke and damp earth, and the sky was a heavy gray, pressing low as though it carried a secret too terrible to spill. Timothy Caldwell hadn't been to school in nearly a month, not since the day his mother carried him into town like a broken doll. Most thought he wouldn't come back at all, that whatever sickness had claimed him would keep him hidden away forever. But that morning, just as the teacher, Miss Eleanor Price, was ringing the bell, the door opened, and there he was, thin, pale, and silent as a shadow. Every head turned, the laughter stopped. You could have heard a pin drop. Timothy stood in the doorway, his clothes too loose, hanging from his frail frame like empty curtains. His eyes. There was something about his eyes. Not silver, not that day, but too bright, too clear, as though they held a light of their own. When Miss Price finally found her voice, it came out shaky but calm. "Timothy," she said, forcing a smile. "Welcome back." He didn't answer. He just stepped inside and walked to the back of the room, his boots barely making a sound on the wooden floor. The other children watched him with wide eyes, shifting uncomfortably as he passed. No one spoke. No one breathed. When he reached his desk, he sat down slowly, his gaze fixed on nothing, like a boy lost in a dream. Class began, and for a while, things seemed normal. Miss Price read from a worn arithmetic book, her voice steady though her hands trembled slightly as she turned the pages. But something felt wrong. The air inside the schoolhouse seemed heavy, almost buzzing, like the moments before a thunderstorm. One of the boys, Henry Cole, kept glancing out the window, certain he heard something moving in the trees. Another girl, Clara Briggs, whispered later that her slate pencil began to roll on its own, slow at first, then faster, spinning in circles on the desk until it clattered to the floor. And then came the sound. It was faint at first, like a low hum, barely louder than a breath. Miss Price paused, listening, her brow furrowing. The children looked around, wide-eyed, whispering. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the wooden walls, through the floor, through their very bones. Books slid across desks. Inkwells trembled. A window pane cracked with a sharp splintering sound. Miss Price shouted for everyone to stay calm, but her voice was swallowed by the noise. It wasn't coming from outside. It wasn't coming from the roof or the ground. It was coming from Timothy. He was sitting perfectly still, his hands folded on his desk, his eyes fixed on the blackboard. But the hum seemed to pour from him, from his chest, from his very skin, as if he were a tuning fork struck by some invisible hand. His hair lifted slightly, like strands of silk floating in water. The children stared in horror as the air around him shimmered, bending like heat above a fire. And then the explosion happened. Not fire, not smoke. Something else, something no one could explain. A blast of air, cold and sharp as glass, burst from where Timothy sat, throwing every child to the floor. Desks toppled. The blackboard cracked down the center. Windows shattered inward, spraying shards like frozen rain. Miss Price hit the wall hard enough to see stars, her ears ringing with a sound she would never forget. Silence. Because after that one terrible second, everything went still. When she opened her eyes, the room was a ruin, splintered wood, broken glass, papers fluttering like dying birds. The children were crying, crawling toward the door. Some were bleeding from shallow cuts. Others just stared blankly, too stunned to move. And Timothy was gone. They searched the schoolhouse first, calling his name, their voices echoing in the broken silence. Then they spread into the yard, the fields, the woods. Nothing. No footprints, no torn clothing, no trail at all. It was the summer of 1867, and the town of Braintree in Massachusetts was quiet, the kind of quiet that came after the Civil War when families tried to rebuild lives torn apart by loss. The war had ended just 2 years earlier, and America was still healing, scarred by memories that refused to fade. Among the cobblestone streets and wooden houses, life moved slowly, with church bells marking the hours and horses pulling wagons through the dirt roads. Yet, in the midst of this ordinary small-town life, there was a boy who would soon become a mystery that science, even in the centuries to come, could not fully explain. His name was Timothy Caldwell. Timothy was 8 years old when people first began to whisper about him. At first glance, he looked like any other boy. Pale skin, thin frame, with a mop of dark brown hair that constantly fell into his eyes. His clothes were worn but clean, hand-sewn by his mother, Margaret Caldwell, a widow who had lost her husband in the final months of the war. They lived in a small house at the edge of the woods, where the trees grew so thick they seemed to swallow the light. People said Margaret hardly ever came to town except to buy flour, sugar, and sometimes a bit of salt pork when she could afford it. She was quiet, polite, and always hurried back home. Few had ever spoken more than a few words to Timothy. But the whispers began because of what Timothy could do, things no boy should have been able to do. It started with something small, or at least that's what the townsfolk believed. One morning, a farmer named Samuel Briggs claimed he saw Timothy standing in the middle of his field, far from the Caldwell house. Samuel waved at him, but the boy didn't wave back. Then, in the blink of an eye, Timothy was gone. There was no sound, no movement, just gone, as if the earth had swallowed him. Samuel thought maybe the boy had crouched down in the tall grass, but when he walked over, there was nothing. Not a footprint, not a broken stalk of corn, nothing. By the time Samuel told his story in the general store, others began to share their own strange encounters. Mrs. Fletcher swore she saw Timothy late one night standing in the graveyard behind the old church, his eyes fixed on the moon. She said his skin looked almost white under the pale light, and his lips were moving like he was whispering something, though she couldn't hear a word. The next second, she blinked, and he wasn't there anymore. Most people laughed these things off. Children wander, they said, people imagine things. But then came the day Margaret Caldwell walked into town carrying Timothy in her arms. He wasn't moving. It was early morning, and the fog clung to the ground like a ghost refusing to leave. Margaret burst into Dr. Elias Morton's clinic, her face streaked with tears, clutching her boy like a mother clutching a broken doll. She laid him on the table, and the doctor saw that Timothy wasn't breathing. His skin was cold, his lips blue. Dr. Morton tried everything he knew, compressions, warm blankets, even a bit of brandy down the boy's throat. Nothing worked. Margaret sobbed silently in the corner, her hands trembling, her eyes hollow. And then, just as the doctor was about to cover the boy's face with a sheet, Timothy gasped. It wasn't a normal gasp, not the desperate inhale of someone drowning in air. It was sharp, almost mechanical, like something inside him had switched on. His chest rose slowly, his eyes flickered open, and for a brief, chilling moment, they didn't look human. The doctor would later tell people, in whispers and with a shaking hand gripping a glass of whiskey, that Timothy's eyes had no color, just silver, bright and cold, like polished metal. When Margaret reached for him, Timothy didn't move. He just stared at the ceiling, silent, his lips parting slightly as if he wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. Then suddenly, he sat up, swung his legs off the table, and walked out of the clinic without a sound. Margaret ran after him, calling his name, but he didn't look back. By the time the doctor followed them to the door, they were gone. For the rest of the day, people searched the woods, the fields, the riverbanks. They found nothing. No footprints, no torn fabric, not even a strand of hair. It was as if Timothy had dissolved into the air. Margaret didn't return home that night, and for 2 whole days, there was no sign of either of them. Then, on the 3rd day, the church bell rang at dawn, and people saw a figure walking down the main street. It was Margaret. Her hair was wild, her dress torn and muddy. She was barefoot. And in her arms, she carried Timothy, asleep, his skin pale as snow. When they asked where she had been, she didn't answer. When they asked what happened to Timothy, her lips trembled, but no sound came. She just clutched him tighter and walked back home.